Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I am so delighted to introduce you to Alexandra Sedlovskaya. Alexandra is Associate Director at the Christensen Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard Business School, where her work focuses on management education and pedagogies that support participant-centered learning. Her research areas include diversity and inclusion, case method teaching, curricular innovation, online and hybrid teaching, and teaching effectiveness. She obtained her PhD in psychology from Yale University in 2011 and extended her research training as a postdoctoral associate at the Yale School of Management. Her research has been published in scholarly journals, including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Psychological Science, and Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Drawing on her research and teaching, Alexandra consults faculty at Harvard Business School and leads workshops and academic institutions and corporations in the US and abroad. Now, on a personal note, I met Dr. Sedlovskaya through a course I took at the Harvard Extension School. And the course is called Self and Identity, which is an incredible course. And Alexandra, you're an incredible professor. And I've shared with you prior to clicking record about how meaningful the course has been for me and how much it helped me to learn about my own sense of identity and identity conflicts and all of these kinds of things. So I'm so deeply grateful to have you here today and talk about such an important topic.
I am delighted to be here. So thank you for having me. And I am so excited to engage in this conversation with you.
So how about we start with, what do you mean by identity?
Yes, I think this is a very important question to get us started. What do we mean by our identities? How do they develop? How do they evolve? And I actually thought that instead of thinking and talking about it abstractly, let's make it very concrete. You've mentioned our course, and you might also recall that we've started our course on the very first day with not just thinking, but engaging with the question of who am I? And not only, as I said, we've been thinking about it, we've actually answered this question at the time. Because, and I hope this is not a spoiler, that it might not be enough of our lifetime to actually answer this question. So instead, what I thought we'd do today is exactly what we've done in our course. We'll take exactly 2 minutes and we will actually answer the question of who am I? And to do that, I actually want to invite all of you who are listening to us right now. So first of all, a huge shout out. Welcome. And don't think for a moment that we were going to forget about our listeners. You are absolutely included in this conversation. So please pause us for a moment. Pause us and please bring a piece of paper, find a pen or a pencil. You're probably thinking, here she goes, giving instructions. I'm not even instructing in class, and here I am giving out instructions already. A little preview. Yes, please grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, and pause us, unpause us when you have it. And we are going to answer the question of who am I? Obviously about you. So not who am I, but thank you for the introduction. But who are you? And I'm going to give you exactly 2 minutes to do this. And let's try to come up with 20 answers. 20 answers in 2 minutes to the question of who am I? It's not a test. You're not going to be graded. The answers are yours. They're yours to keep. They're yours to change. They're yours to add it. But let's do this. And I'm going to ask you to do the same. So I am going to count. I have a timer. 2 minutes. It's like I'm proctoring the test on the clock. And you probably recall doing this once. So without consulting your prior list, let's try doing this again. And hopefully I've talked long enough. If you didn't pause us, that you already still had a chance to grab a piece of paper and a pen. And please sit down. It's so different. I promise you, it's very different than when you just like, I'm just going to think about my answers. Then when you're actually sitting down and writing out the answers. So let's do that. So on my go, 2 minutes on the clock, answers to the question of who am I? Go. So let's take another 30 seconds or so. And I hope you're also ready if you're listening to us right now. 10 seconds. Oh, I never knew that was my last time walking. All right. Who knew? But that was honest. I actually kept time. So let's pause for a moment. And this is why it's really important that you actually written down your responses too, not just favorite. Let's actually just take a look at our lists that you've generated in those 2 minutes. Like I said, they're not final. You're not submitting them. They're yours to keep. But just take a look at them. All right, there we go. The timer's off. So take a look at your answers. Did you complete the list fully? Did you come down with 20 items? Did you have a hard time coming up with 20 items? Or did you feel like you could just keep going and going and going? Vera, did you complete your list?
I think so. I haven't counted, but it looks like about 20. Yes.
And that's another interesting. Did you actually number them and count it?
I think this time. Mm-hmm.
And this is the question for our listeners. As you're looking at your list, even thinking about it, what point did you start experiencing difficulty? I mean, you might not have. You might have just zoomed through and like, I could have kept going. Too bad I had to stop at 20. But if you start experiencing difficulty at some point, what items came, or what answers came after you started experiencing this much more difficult time coming out with answers? Conversely, what's at the top of your list? Take a look and see what is at the top of your list. Are you surprised? What's at the top? Maybe not surprised. Are you surprised what's not on the list? Maybe you feel like, I'm surprised why it didn't even come up in those 2 minutes. I thought it would have been there. Which is why, again, it's really important that we make the list as we think about it. Think about maybe are any of the items negatively or positively valenced? And again, we can have very different understanding of whether the same item is positive or negative based on your own perception. Where is your list? Vera, since you're the only one that has a conversational partner right now, it's going to be all on you to give me all those answers. Like, welcome back to my class.
Thank you. It's so cool to do this again, because I have to say, when I did this the first time, I remember the things that the list has started with. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, daughter, sister, granddaughter, friend, right? And so on and so forth. And then it went to like the professional stuff. I'm a coach, I'm a speaker, I'm a trainer. And then it went to some traits about myself. And then I remember then it kind of shifted to, and I can't remember if we did 20 or 30 when we were in class, but then it
20.
shifted at some point to.
I did not make it easier or harder, I promise.
I remember then it went to like some things that are about myself that are not like ideal, right? Some things that I see as, as things that who I am, but not necessarily, what we would say is like socially, ideal. And it's so interesting because this time around, I started with what was like, who am I? Like at a heart level, almost like a soul level. Things like I'm kind, things like that. And then it went to traits like I'm, funny, I'm, those kinds of things. And then it went to with self-compassion, like I am imperfect, right? I am shy, right? Because, I can be very shy and things like that. So, but it was cool because this time, like writing those things and not feeling negative about writing those things, but having taken the class and the many other things that I've done, it's like, I accept that I am who I am. And I love myself with the imperfections at this point, right? I mean, there's things to improve like everybody else.
I'm actually getting
that's
goosebumps.
cool.
I'm getting goosebumps listening to this.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexandra. It's very cool now to kind of see how the flip, the list. So I still have wife, mother, those things, but it's not the who I am now that I see as it's things that I do. And I remember, Alexandra, the final project that I did for the class, I chose to do, we could have done many different things, but I chose to create different masks, like physical masks for different aspects of myself. One of them also being my kind of future best self, my, the little kid inside of me that sometimes feels certain emotions or feeling ashamed of things or whatever. And I remember that was really profound, which is probably contributing to why the list is the way that it is now. Yeah.
And I think this is, again, going back to our listeners. How did it feel writing down the different items? And did you put down perhaps social desirable items first? Would your list be different if you knew you had to share versus you didn't have to share what's on the list? What is it that we're choosing to reveal and to whom? And just now, to put it a little bit more in terms of the research language with your examples, and this might be useful as we think about, back to your question, what are our identities, how we develop them, how they evolve. Even some of the examples you've given, you mentioned adjectives on your list. And the first time around, they didn't come until later, it sounds like. And I'm curious for our listeners, did you have adjectives on your list? When did your adjectives come into the list? And the adjectives, as you just call them, traits, these are our personal identities. These are the identities that describe us, our traits. You also mentioned mother. In my case, an instructor, you mentioned others. Those are our role identities. Those are the identities that we derive from having a partner in a complementary role. So to be a mother, typically you need to have a child. To be an instructor, you need to have a student. Those are our role identities that we derive from having a partner in that complementary role. And then we have our social identities. And again, the boundaries are blurry, and we don't have to necessarily stick with those definitions, but they're useful. So social identities are identities we derive from meaningful membership in social groups. Like, I'm a woman. We might have many different group memberships. We don't necessarily form identities around all of our group memberships, but it's the meaningful ones that we derive our identities. And so if we look in the list, I know I've told you to generate 20. You didn't have to generate 20. It was just more of an assessment. What came later, what came to the top. But we have multiple identities, as you mentioned. We have role identities that might be multiple, and our traits can define us differently in those different identities. And even the way the same traits manifest in terms of behaviors can be different. I can be very caring as a mother and as an instructor, but the way I show my caring, you're welcome, could be very different. I've yet to pick up a student and kiss a student as a student walks into the door, the way I do my children, but I show care in different ways. Right? I set high standards, I set high support, I care deeply, but it manifests differently. And so this exercise, what I hope it shows is that we have multiple identities. And in the context, I'm also curious because now you're taking this in a very different context than what you did in our class. Even where you are when you're doing the list can prime us to think of one identity, make one of our identities more salient. Right now, I'm talking to you, I'm talking about research. So maybe my identity as an academic might be more salient now. I also have kids who came home early today because it's a short day at school. Right? And so my mother identity might be primed. For example, if I hear them running around, we also have a dog, right? So we're having multiple identities that can come based on the context, based on the timing, online, more or less. And sometimes we can integrate these multiple identities. Actually, the good example is right now I'm drawing on examples from my identity as a mother to illustrate research that I do in my identity as an academic. So that would be an example of how we can potentially integrate our identities. On the other hand, if the kids start playing loudly with the dog and the dog starts barking, there can actually be a context in which my identities start to conflict with each other. And similarly, not only they intersect, so it's not just additive, like I'm a mother, I'm an academic, they intersect and they also evolve over time. So this question of who are we? As I said, our lifetime may not be enough because we evolve. We gain identities, we lose identities, we shift meaning in our existing identities. And it's not that we just have -1, +1 identity. Gaining or losing an identity can also dynamically shift our understanding of how we navigate our other identities. That sounded very conceptual. So let me give an example. You mentioned in my bio, right? So when I was just getting my doctorate degree, I also became a mother. But it wasn't just an additive effect. Like, oh, and now I'm also a mother. Right? I had to really rethink my other identities and how am I going to navigate My identity as a student, for example, also being a mother. So that's what I mean by our identities shift dynamically, not only with context, but also over time. So let me pause here, but hopefully this better captures this question that you've originally started us with. What do we mean by identity?
It absolutely does. And I really appreciate that you gave our listeners and viewers an opportunity to experience it for themselves and notice what is at the top of their list and where are they right now, as they're thinking about this, and how has that primed their answers, and also thinking of what identities are linked to, to people and situations, because one of the things that we talk a lot about on this show is change, whether it's personal life changes like you're describing, right? Having a baby as you're also a student, and or maybe getting a new job, starting a new business, shifting jobs, especially when our identity is so deeply attached to a position, a role, the responsibilities, respect, recognition, whatever that might be. And then either us choosing to step away from that or having it be taken away from us, how that can really rock our sense of identity and create such a grief in a sense. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, and my thoughts and also research around self-complexity. And this is a really interesting point. So it's not that simply having more identities is better. It's not like you just go down the list and like, how many identities do I have? It's not necessarily that straightforward. But the idea is if we do have multiple meaningful identities, and there is some distinction between those identities, so they're not completely overlapping, then having this self-complexity in moments of stress can actually protect us from the negative consequences of that stressor. So just to give an example, let's say there's something stressful you're experiencing at work, but you can also find a way to affirm yourself in the other role. For example, as a mother. I'm going to go personal because, I'm surprised we've gotten that long and I haven't. I give personal examples in my class. I give personal examples in my corporate talks. They're never planned, but they're spontaneous. But I remember when I was a student before becoming a mother, the identity of a student was so central. It was occupying most of my self-concept. So any even potential threat to how I'm going to do would rock my world. I am not exaggerating. Because if I were doing the list, perfectionist, overachiever would be, talking about, be realistic with yourself would be on my list. And then I became a mother. And I will never forget. Yeah, it didn't make me any less responsible of a student. But all of a sudden I had this other identity of a mother. And yes, I was still very responsible studying, but I will never forget the moment when I was rocking my baby as I was studying for dissertation prospectus, which is basically you meet with the committee and you go through the committee and they basically tell you whether you can go on to defend the dissertation, defend the dissertation. And my advisor called and said, oh my goodness, this is getting really serious. People are being cut from the program, which usually would be enough to send me into the panic mode. And here I am rocking my baby. And it's not that I didn't care. And not that I didn't prepare. But all of a sudden, it felt like I had affirmation in my other role. And I was being less stressed overall as a result of that. So this is an example of when we have multiple identities that are meaningful to us, that if something happens to threaten one of our identities, there is some buffering against stress that's happening, which is different from having a split sense of self when we're actually being torn. Like there are moments when, because you're both a mother and you're an academic, and you're being torn in the direction of how do you both, that's a very different concept that I'm talking about. But having multiple identities and navigating them can actually be very helpful. But it can also be a stressful experience. And I think it's perfectly fine to actually embrace that when we're re-navigating, when we have to learn how to re-navigate our identities, it could be a place of discomfort. But as you know, I say in the first day, you have not subscribed to comfort in this classroom. Like learning can be uncomfortable, different from painful, right? Discomfort, like yoga teachers say, you lean into your discomfort, not pain. But discomfort often means growth. So we want to make sure we separate pain from discomfort, but we want not to shy away from discomfort.
Absolutely. I personally believe that the stimulus for growth is discomfort. and how and even when I think about like when we learned about identity crisis, which maybe in a moment you can kind of describe for people what that means, and the mind shift I remember that I had is that that in and of itself is a process for our exploration, right? For that growth of, kind of pivoting to who am I and who do I want to be, and so maybe we can touch on that really fast. So for our listeners, what is an identity crisis, and
Yes. And I think even this question, not only what is identity crisis, but what do we actually experience when we hear the word crisis?
Yeah.
But if we just think about crisis, like it's really dramatic impact and not usually positively valenced, impact. What do we think about it as identity exploration? Because this is back to discomfort, where, as you mentioned, in the discomfort we experience when we're faced with uncertainty. And if we're faced with uncertainty, this is the place where many of us think like, okay, we're in an identity crisis. We don't know who we are. Or we can this is a great opportunity to explore. And again, it might be just one identity. It might be part of your identity. Remember, they're interlinked. But it's not that you just don't know who you are and then you know who you are. Right? That's not how it works. Usually it may be shifting or losing or gaining or changing meaning. One of your identities can throw us into the sense of uncertainty, the moratorium stage that we've discussed, where we try potentially to get out of it, either by becoming what we call identity achieved, meaning, okay, I know who I am, or I'm not even going to think about it, right? And we're diffused. But spending this time in the space of uncertainty can actually be very, and not thinking about it as crisis, but thinking about it as exploration can actually be very powerful. And recognizing that we can move into the space of identity achieved, spend some time in identity achieved, and then cycle back into exploration. What we often think about as midlife crisis could be actually another opportunity for us to explore again, and then we can become again identity achieved, and then we can again become exploring. But I would, talking about perception shift, think about this more as an opportunity to explore identity, which could be scary, which could be frightening, which could be uncomfortable, but it can also be an opportunity. Because again, one of the other items on my list, if I were doing Who Am I, is an optimist, always, which again, sometimes it does set me up for some disappointment, but then again, I rebound because I'm an optimist. But I think this idea of identity crisis, identity exploration, and thinking about it to the extent possible as an identity exploration could be very helpful.
I think a lot of people, Alexandra, are looking for like the who am I really and what is really meaningful. They've lived so many different roles in their life, and some maybe are roles that they were conditioned into or thought that they needed to be or to do. But at some point they realize I'm not really fulfilled in this role, or I'm not fulfilled anymore. And they're really seeking to understand, who they are and really go through that exploration. So, or maybe some people are saying, well, I've been in that process of exploration for 20 years and I still don't know, right? So what can they do to gain more clarity around that sense of self and who they are?
And there's not a single right answer to this question. But what I want to emphasize is this idea of maybe they've been conditioned in this place. So maybe they've stepped into this place either without even questioning it necessarily, without having spent time in the moratorium stage. A lot of it can be also society dictated. It's actually much harder for us to then deviate from where we're supposed to be and the default setting to maybe that's not what I wanted to do, and shift into the moratorium. A lot of times, and there's so many identities that we foreclosed on, meaning we've been conditioned to be there and we're fine with them. We never questioned. To give an example, we've potentially given a society where we've been raised, our families, our social settings, getting married, having children might be an expected identity. And for me, that's actually what I followed. I never questioned it. I don't regret it now. And that's fine, right? We might have that. There might be other identities. For example, where do we go to school? Do we go to certain institutions? Which professions maybe our parents had different vision for our professions and we need to question that. That could be a harder place because now we're deviating from the default, and deviating from the default can always be scary, especially if we already had taken so many steps toward the default and now we have to shift. And I think it's less about how do you gain more certainty, and it's more, can we actually start deviating to allow ourselves to explore that space, it's really important to be realistic. You can be optimistic and realistic. It's actually called depressive realism. But the point is, sometimes there's also social devaluation attached to some of the identities. And so it's not just having multiple identities. Maybe what we just said, maybe there's some stigma, like, for example, oh my gosh, you don't have kids, you don't marry. It's not just, oh, we're going to deviate. There might be stigma attached, or there might be actually stigma attached the opposite way. You're employed, you're in the corporate setting, like, oh my gosh, you're a mother. Like, you might not be committed. So stigma can go either way. Social devaluation can go a different way depending on the context. But it's there. And I think it would be naive to talk about identities without realizing that identities also come with social value. And it's harder to steer away from something that we think is socially valued into the uncertain, or when some of our identities might be socially devalued in a setting. So I'll pause here. And I know this is not exactly when your question is like, how do we gain more certainty? But I think even just being self-aware that what you're going through, the understanding the process can actually make it much easier. If you understand more what's happening, it's then easier, I think, to embrace what's happening, because you feel like you are more actually empowered rather than something's happening to you, that you understand what is happening, and then you can feel more empowered throughout this process.
I agree 100% that this is, I think the empowerment here is coming from that sense of agency or choice. So let's say if somebody chooses not to have children or not to adopt children or whatever that might be. But the idea here is that it's a choice. And, just last night I was walking back, to the car at the airport with my eldest daughter, Maya. And we saw this gorgeous convertible, this bright red, shiny, like awesome convertible. And the license plate on it was 0 kids. And I looked at that, and it was so interesting because my first inner thought was, oh, that's so sad. Right. Which my head was like, as soon as that kind of became conscious to me, I'm like, Vered, why would it be sad? If that person is choosing to not have children, let's say, that's amazing. That's beautiful. So what do we do if we are now aware that, we're not happy in some aspect of our life? How do we shift that, I guess, while still maintaining a core identity?
Yes. And I think this question is actually even more impactful than we are making it to be, because you said courage and you said choice. And absolutely, I want us to feel empowered that it is our choice. And it certainly takes courage. I also want to recognize the power of social context, right? There are costs. And sometimes the costs, I want to be very realistic, sometimes the costs might be too high. For example, let's say there's a certain identity that might be devalued in a certain setting, like in the workplace setting. And do I just come out with this identity? But then what if I'm risking being fired and I have kids, I have maybe elderly parents, maybe I have someone else I'm taking care of, that it's not just about me, right? My choices are also going to impact others. So I just want to also acknowledge that even when we say choice, the choice sometimes is incredibly hard choice to do. And I think this is where it's really important, at least, to recognize that we do have the choice. And then we can choose what we want to do. And do we have optionality? Can we choose, for example, a profession or a setting or a context in which our identity might be not necessarily devalued? Also recognizing that it's not necessarily that if I'm working for a place that does not mean to me and I'm living is because of that courage, right? We also have, it's a trade-off because we do have multiple identities with competing demands on our time. But to give you an example, when I was on the job market years ago, I was actually explicitly told, as one advice, maybe you don't want to talk about your kids. And you've noticed, I talk about my kids a lot. I use example of my kids. Like, maybe because nobody's obligated to ask you, they're actually not allowed to ask you. So maybe you shouldn't bring it up, because we know from research, not only women might be seen as less competent, but women who have kids actually losing out even more on the perceived competence dimension. So maybe you don't want to bring it up. For me, this was a choice, because at least I recognize that I had a choice. So even recognizing that we do have a choice, sometimes we might not like the cost of the choice, but we have a choice. So now we can decide which way we want to go. I've made the conscious decision, because I frankly, I could afford to make this decision. I want to be very realistic. To be like, no, I'm going to talk about the kids. Because if the place is not responding, then that's probably not the place where I want to be. But then we need to be very realistic in understanding what are those costs. And I bring up my kids in institutional settings, I bring up like in corporate settings, I use it as an example. And I think if you have the more place of influence, then also role modeling that. What environment do you set for others? So that I think I want to kind of flip it a little bit into thinking from the leadership perspective. What place do you give for others so that you do not have to create such difficult choices for people to make? So that people can feel that while they're not obligated, they can actually, for example, be in the workspace and feel like they can be themselves in that workspace without having to make those really costly decisions. But all of this to say that even recognizing that we have a choice is already important, and recognizing maybe this is not the time for choice is also fine, but then incrementally. Going incrementally is also great. I mean, we're making movement. And this is where, again, I'm an optimist, but we don't have to just fly off into a different direction immediately.
And I appreciate that you took us, in that direction of leadership and how to create a culture, an environment where people can feel safe to be themselves. And, I know one of your areas of expertise is diversity and inclusion. And, we've done a lot of talking even in the course that we took about in-groups and out-groups and on all of the research behind that. So what specific practical tips can you give to a leader that's listening today about how to do that with their team?
Yes. And I think it's, I talked about the leaders who are creating the space for people to be who they want to be. And I want to be very clear that inclusive space isn't a space where you obligate people, like bring everything to work. Like, I want to know about your kids, right? And so this inclusive place isn't a place where people feel obligated to reveal all parts of themselves, right? Inclusive space is the space where people feel welcome to be themselves if they'd like to do it. And frankly, it's through these conversations. I actually think that, and there's research on that, you might even have policies, like non-discriminatory policies, but if the practices don't support it, if in practice, even policy, in theory, you say, be yourself, oh, not that self, bring yourself, oh, not that part, right? It's also really important to recognize what is happening in practice. Are you genuinely supporting people? Or do they have a sense that this is just more of a policy rather than practice? Are they feeling supported? If they feel welcome to bring themselves. I remember when I started to teach years ago, one of the advice I received was basically go in there and do not be yourself. And I just remember being very curious, like, which part of me shouldn't I be? Because remember what we talked about, we have multiple identities. So which part of me shouldn't I be? And it was very meaningful and well-intentioned advice. Like, look, you're young. In age, you're probably not much older than your students. Interestingly, as I get older, my students also get older in terms of where I teach. So that doesn't change much, but you're not much older than your students. You're very informal. You probably noticed that too. You crack jokes. You don't dress formally. You're going to have really hard time gaining credibility. In the classroom, students will not know that you've been valedictorian, that you have National Science Foundation grant, and you can't even say that in a way that doesn't seem like you're just self-promoting. And we know that we get backlash, especially as women, if we tend to self-promote. So the advice had been, like, just not be yourself. And I think as leaders, how we role model too is really, really important. I spent some time thinking about this. I even tried it, to be honest. I've tried that. Back to this idea of what you said. What happens when you make choices? I've tried being more formal, dressing more formal, like keeping more formal distance, psychological distance. I've realized I wasn't effective in that space because, first of all, there was a lot of cognitive effort that was going into that I really should have been focusing that effort on listening to the students. And we know that when we're trying to conceal an important part of who we are, our cognitive effort and our attention is being taken on us rather than on others. And as leaders, back to your question, being focused on how we can support others, which means being self-aware, but the focus should be on others. And I wasn't able to do that when I was, or maybe not doing enough, when I was so focused on how I'm coming across. And that is so true, that when we create circumstances where people have to worry about constant self-monitoring to make sure that they don't reveal something about themselves, that's a lot of cognitive effort. And I also wasn't able to create what I thought was a sense of learning community the way we have in our class now, the sense of we are all in it together, because I wasn't feeling a sense of belonging. I love this quote that says, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And when you're trying to fit in, you're not belonging. And so as a leader, I wasn't being effective either, because I was not so much self-aware as I was just really self-conscious. And there's a huge difference between being self-aware and being self-conscious. Now, I still made adjustments to be an effective leader in the room. I give up being formal. I'm very informal. You've seen it. I share personal stories. I crack jokes. Not all of them are funny. Maybe most of them are not funny, but that's something that is just part of who I am. And I decided to keep that. Back to choices. But I've made some choices to adjust. For example, I don't know if our listeners notice, but I speak fast. So if you thought you'll be watching this podcast at 1.5 speed, I mean, you might be still doing that, but I'm impressed. In fact, when I tell my students in class that this is 1/3 of my regular speed, it is, dear listeners, 1/3 of my regular speed. So some of my students actually started putting me on 1.5 just to see for a moment what it's like when I go full speed. And so I actually adjusted. So like the way I'm adjusting, believe it or not, I'm adjusting now, yes. So this is not to you, this is to the listeners, because I know I can go faster. But I realized that to be an effective leader, we also need to make certain adjustments based on our self-awareness, because if people do not understand me, I'm not an effective leader in the classroom, right? So it's really this interplay of what is it that is absolutely essential for us to keep, and it's an exploration. It's an exploration. It takes time. And this is back to your earlier question. What can we do? We need to give ourselves space to experiment. Like I've experimented, I've learned. Of course, we might not always afford to experiment, but to the extent to which we can, I want to be realistic. I've experimented. I've tried. Like, this whole formal thing is not working for me. But speaking slower is probably a good idea, right? So, and again, maybe I could go even slower. But this is what I mean by really being both self-aware as a leader, but being focused on others to see what impact you're having, not only through the policies we set, but what is it for us in practice? And are we also role modeling? And not necessarily by just spilling everything, expecting others to spill everything back, but do we create the space where they can, and they will feel still included and supported?
Yeah, I think
that answered the question.
It did, because, it's this concept that this change, right? If we want a change in the culture and the team for people to be more comfortable, right, to align with their true self, or their identities, I think that it starts with us. That change starts with us as leaders, and as you said, modeling it, and that first starts it requires our own self-exploration and courage, right, to make that choice of what do I want to, keep here at the workplace, and what maybe do I want to dial down a little bit. Again, being a choice, a conscious choice. And I think that what you were saying around how not being aligned with who we truly are does take a toll. It takes a lot of energy. It creates distance between ourselves and others, as you said, because we're so focused on wearing the mask, right, projecting the persona, and wanting people to believe or think something about us. That we, it takes energy. And I think it also depletes the energy in our body. I think that it can create some incoherence in the body. And I say that because, one of the guests that we had on the show is a gentleman called Dr. Jeffrey Rediker, who's actually a Harvard a professor as well. And he wrote a book called Cured, and studying spontaneous remissions. And one of the pillars, I don't know if you're familiar with this, one of the pillars was, identity and belief, kind of like in releasing those shoulds, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about that, about this concept of releasing all of those conditioned shoulds? I should be.
And you mentioned masks too, right? And I think where I want, and you mentioned that your final project, which I remember very well, dealt with masks. And I want to be very clear again in making this distinction between masks and having different identities. As we said, we have multiple identities, and we have personal, this is back to our conversation where we've started. We have personal identities that might describe us differently, or we might behave differently in those roles. Now, we're still us. We still feel organically us, right? This would not be an example when there is a split in ourselves, like what I should be, what society is saying to be, still us, which is us in different roles. And sometimes we might not even know. Like back to exploration, I think is so important. We often assume that we know who we are in all of those roles. And we step into the new role, we might not even know. We have to learn who we are and how to be effective in that role. And that's evolving process, back to experimentation, back to allowing the space to learn. Oh my goodness, this is new. And you're trying, and you're learning, and you're exploring. I think the reflection is really critical. As a leader, what I find over and over and over again, speaking with successful leaders, very busy people, especially busy people, they make sure that they find time for reflection, or they tend to find time for reflection. This is how we learn, by reflecting. Otherwise, it's just experience and not experiential learning. It's the reflection that turns experience into experiential learning, is the reflection. And this is different. This is actually learning how to be effective while still being us in the role, which is different from when we're wearing masks. And I think that's the important distinction, because when we're wearing masks, and I know I'm using the word role, but role is not like theatrical role in the sense of us Shakespearean role, right? Or we're putting on masks in the theater. When we're putting masks, that's not being us. Right? That's not being us. That's pretending either to be something else. It's hiding an important part of who we are. And my own research points precisely to what's happening when we're going through this experience on the cognitive level. Experiences divide in terms of, okay, this is me at work and this is me at home. Not because we just happen to have different roles, but because we don't feel this integrated. And again, we don't necessarily need to integrate, but we don't feel like we are us in both places. We feel that maybe I can be more myself in this one context, but not another. Yes, that has cognitive consequences. To your point, when you talked before, how much are you monitoring? How much is it happening with us cognitively? What kind of toll it's taking us, and how well we can be performing at work, psychologically, sense of belonging. And this is where I want to be very realistic. Part of it might be our own expectations. So some of them might not necessarily be biased. It doesn't have to be set in genuine. Sometimes what we perceive as reality is our reality. And what we might be thinking is not necessarily what's happening. And so some of it might be we just set our own expectations that now we're trying to meet. Others could actually be set. We might be experiencing some biases, or we actually set up really different expectations for ourselves, often not based on our own values, but on the values society placed on us, and we didn't even question them. And I think it's actually spending time in deciding, when we're thinking about those the barriers or those aspirations or expectations that we set on ourselves, is it something we truly want? And this is based on truly on our values, and those are very hard to separate. Sometimes they're aligned with society. Like, I want a kid, society, dictated, that we should have kids. That was easily aligned, right? Sometimes we might say, actually, what society dictates is not what's going to make me happy, right? This is the value that I've set for myself based on expectations that aren't mine. And now I am feeling divided because of something that's been externally imposed. And it's figuring out, where do we want, again, to change? Where it's just a discomfort that we need to go through to get better? And where do we need to let go? Because, as you've said in the very beginning, to have self-compassion, to actually expect and accept us as who we are. And I think that, again, goes back to this conscious choice. We don't want to rationalize. We don't want to be like, you know what? I don't feel like doing this, so I'm just going to accept myself. That's rationalization, right? We're just making up excuses. It's like, if you don't want to do something, you're going to come up with 100 excuses not to do it. No, we're not there. But understanding, what is it that we really want to change about us? And where we're creating this unnecessary divide based on the expectations that we've set that are not aligned with our values. And this is where we need to spend more time actually learning how to self-accept ourselves and show self-compassion.
This is such an important conversation, Alexandra. I really hope that the people listening are getting what you're sharing here and are, willing to explore what are their perceptions of their identity, the who they think they are. And when there is that kind of a split, to really go inward and as you said, to take that time to reflect and say, what is most important to me? What do I care about? Right. And what am I choosing to do moving forward? And then there are times when, an identity is shifted not by our own choice. Like, for example, when my father passed away several years ago, about 5 years ago, my mother's identity was so correlated, I believe, with my dad and being with my dad and supporting him and all of that, that when that was taken away, I think she struggled for a long time. So what about, and if you don't mind, just really quickly, in situations like that, where we see ourselves as something, but again, that is shifting?
Absolutely. And in fact, we call it self-concept clarity, the idea, and this is literally like incorporating, in this case, in your mom's case, her husband, into her own self-concept. It's like, who am I without you? And in fact, there's some powerful studies, and maybe you want to try this too, by the way. And when I say this, I mean, I'm addressing the listeners. You probably should get to know by now. I'm almost talking to you like you are right here with us. I hope you feel like you're right here with us, because this is how we see it, that you're right here with us. So you might want to try this as well. When people are given a set of words and asked to decide very quickly whether this word describes either them or their partner, if the word either describes both of them or doesn't describe either of them, they're really fast. When they slow down is when the word might describe one of them but not another. Shows again this integration, who am I without you? And to me, understanding gives us huge power. Just understanding what's happening. When we lose someone with whom we have such integrated concept of who we are, like a huge part of who we are integrates the other person in our self-concept. Oftentimes we kind of run away. Like, what do we do about it? Oh my God, what do we do? First, it's okay to just be in that space. We just lost someone to whom, right, our self-concept has been so closely tied. It's absolutely not only fine, it's desirable to have some space and allow that space, because a lot of times we either try to feel it or push it. And this is where I think a lot of times, remember what we talked about, we're moving from that uncertainty stage, we're trying to get really fast, either into achieved or into diffuse, where we're doing like either distract us by not thinking about it, or try to move in a direction that might not necessarily make us happy in the long run. Taking that space to be, to reflect, again, to explore our identities. What do we enjoy? What does it mean for us? This is where spending a bit of time in that space and not thinking about this crisis, we're coming back to this, but really thinking about this. Yes, it's okay to take the space to explore, who am I without you? What does it mean? What I enjoy? And if we're going back to the answers that we've written 20 years ago on the who am I list, those might have changed. Or if we're clinging to another identity now in search to fill that space, then might not be it. What exactly are we looking to feel? What are we missing? Obviously, we're missing the person, but what I mean is, what else in that self? Where am I if I feel like, for example, if I ever stop teaching, which is hard to believe now, but what is it about, right? What is it about that really gives me joy? So we can step back and think, what's the essence? What is it about it that gives me, maybe there are other ways I can find a way to fulfill myself. And this is where, again, spending this time exploring is not only acceptable, I think it's desirable.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think, when I think of change, right, point A to point B, right, there's a transition. And if we go straight to like achievement, right, or diffusion, as you said, like just numbing out or not, not being with it, not being with the emotions and the chaotic thoughts and all of the uncertainty. And, and just allowing ourselves to be in that transition, which, it can be very dark and it can be very confusing because we're not in the old relationship, in the old job, in the old whatever, right? And we're not yet in the new, but we're kind of in that exploration. And when we see it as a process of active exploration, and we have resources, people in our life, or tools that we can use to self-regulate the emotions and make it just a little bit softer, and not feel alone during that process, then it certainly makes it easier for us to not only transition from point A to point B, right, from the old self to the new self, so to speak, but we've also transformed because now we've gained some, awarenesses about ourselves. We were maybe more attuned to what's really deeply meaningful to us. What is it from that job or that relationship, that essence, as you called it, that we want to find a way to keep in some way in our life, right, or to recreate in a different lens, so that we're not losing that, and we're gaining more because we're finding even more meaning and fulfillment.
And I don't want, again, to sound very out of touch with reality, in the sense like this is all cheery. It's scary. It can be so scary. But I think it also at the end is much more fulfilling. And I remember when I was looking for jobs, I was all over the place. Now I advise students because I remember, even though it's been years, I remember what it felt like being literally all over the place. There was one trajectory. There was more default trajectory, right? You complete your PhD, you go to become 10-year professor. It's just one, especially if you do well, then the school like, yes, that's what you do. And here I was, the student in the doctoral program who was expected to go in this one way. I'm like, whoa, I'm going to pause and I'm going to explore anywhere from think tank, consulting, right? Everything, the traditional 10-year track. That was a scary place to be, where you're like, wow, there are all those opportunities. What do I want to do? Very scary place, especially there's also external pressure. So do you have a job? What do you do? How are you doing it? I understand also, right there. I also want to understand that I was privileged in the sense that I didn't have to be rushed to make the decision, right? I could take my time. I was a postdoc, so I had absolutely resources, to your point, social support, financial support, to be able to make that decision. But it was still a very scary place as you're thinking about it. But what it forced me to do is to back and really think about not just what do I want to do in terms of the profession, because a lot of times what sounds good is like the title or the profession. But then when you get to day, like, not so much, right? Or maybe, right, somebody else already predetermined that for us. But then when you get to day, like, I'm not enjoying this, and I'm doing this a lot of hours. And so for me, it was actually stepping back and like, what is it that I actually want to be doing? Not what I want to be called, right? Not what I want other people to think I'm doing, right? But what is it actually that I want to do? And I'm like, okay, so I want to do research. I want to do. So there was this component. And why? What am I actually looking for? That I was actually able to piece together almost the kind of the job set. Again, it's hard. I understand that it's also coming from a place of privilege, but it also was coming from a place of being really scared. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this. I could have just gone in this one direction and not open up this whole Pandora door into all this uncertainty. And in fact, when I was interviewing, I specifically said, I still recall this. I said, look, I'll be with you for 2 years. I think they still remember this. I'm going to give 2 years of my full commitment. And then I might either go, because that's how scary it is. That's how hard it is to deviate from what's default. And then I can maybe still switch to this very traditional role, right? And this was when I've gotten to the Teaching and Learning Center, where I'm now associate director. I said, either, right, I can switch back to the very traditional 10-year role that's been envisioned for me, or I'll stay here indefinitely. And I've been now at the center for over a decade. Right? And I developed my own course that I'm teaching. I coach faculty. I have an amazing team at my center. But it's been all partly because I've spent all this scary place of figuring out, like, what is it that I actually want to be doing, and even being upfront. I'm not sure, but this is exactly what I think about when I think about being in the moratorium stage of that active exploration.
Wow, that is an awesome example. And I think anyone who's been in that place, certainly any entrepreneur, right? When you're stepping away from some certainty, right, of a traditional job, or really anybody who's making any career transition or life transition is in that place. And oftentimes when we give ourselves the space to go inward and to really explore and or have those conversations, right? Notice what feels good, what lights us up. We tend to end up in places that are even more fulfilling beyond the title or the pay or the all of that external stuff. Yeah.
And it's scary, but it can also be very rewarding. And I think you're an example of that, because that's how we've met through the course that I've developed. And I think the reason why I'm bringing up this example is because it's easy when we're looking from the outside to just see our achievements. You've introduced me and you've listed the achievements. And I think it's so easy to just see the outcome. What's not as transparent is the process, it's the struggle, right? It's those decisions and the choices that we have to make. And sometimes we even forget, maybe because we want to forget some of those difficult or scary places. And the reason why I like to bring them up and go back is because these are really important part of that process. And if we recognize it, then it could be both scary, but it can also be very rewarding.
Absolutely. I think most people resist that transition from point A to point B in a change. And I think when we realize that it is, yes, it's chaotic and uncertain and sometimes scary, as you said. And of course, we can soften that using different resources and tools. It's also the most creative, innovative time because we're not attached to anything. Unlimited possibilities are at our disposal, and we can really create it the way we want it. And I think that's the magic. And this is why I appreciate that you're helping us see this shift of, how to see that as a process of a joyful, active exploration when we can see it as that and accept it as that and expect it to be tough because it will be, right? That's typical. So I'm so grateful to you. I've shared with you again before the recording how touched I was by this incredible course, how it has impacted my relationship with myself, my relationship with my children, my husband, my clients. And I would love for people to learn about how they can maybe even become a student of the class or access your different research and all the things that you do.
And I know I've been talking to you, our listeners, as if you're here. I've already said that. It would be wonderful to hear from you, actually, as opposed to just envisioning you on the other end. So first of all, you should feel free to reach out. And you know that I'm incredibly straightforward. That probably came off in this conversation. But first of all, please do not hesitate to reach out. I don't know if you'll provide my email, but I'm always open to continuing conversation. So first of all, do reach out. I obviously feel very passionate about this. My research, all the research that I publish is in academic journals, so you can certainly look that way. I'm excited that the course, this is going to be, I think, 7th year of this course. And I would never have any course for this long if it was just me lecturing, because I already know what I'm going to say. And even if I'm updating the material still, it's really the students. And I say this, and I mean this, that it's really the students who make the course, which is why I've been teaching this course for so many years. And every day it's a journey. And I'm really excited that we're about to embark on another journey in the end of January. I should probably have the date. We can probably look it up, but it's at the Harvard Extension School website. You should be able to look at the catalog. The course is on self and identity. That's the name of the course, self and identity. And what's beautiful about this course is that you can join it in different ways. Right? And you're smiling because you can join it either in person from campus. We have really beautiful space in person. Some students visit, and some people come regularly. You can also join us during our live sessions on Zoom and engage in our live discussions. And you can join us completely synchronously, actually, by watching the recording and then annotating the recording, sharing your thoughts, reflecting, and asynchronously interacting with your classmates. But what it allows us to do is to bring true diversity of experiences, of perspectives, of identities, and learn from each other. And I think maybe that's a good way to end in this idea of not being afraid of change. And we've talked about maybe change is easier when things aren't going well, but what if things are actually going well? And do we change if things are going well? Before this course, I've only taught in person, right? So smaller classes. And when I've learned that I had this opportunity to teach this course in a hybrid space where not only some people will be with me in person and others will be with us live remotely, but some of my students will be completely asynchronous. When we're talking about issues around self and identity, my first response was, oh, no, I'm not doing that. Why? Because if something is working well already, why change it, right? But this is back to reflection and back to remember, why are we doing this? Why are we doing? Back to thinking about the values and the purpose. We haven't talked about it, but having the purpose, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And I've realized that by actually opening up the space, we would allow to expand diversity of perspectives, the diversity of experiences that we have in our class. And that's what I mean by learning truly with each other, from each other. And frankly, this, I think, what leadership is. It's enabling us to create the space where we can both individually and collectively learn together. So this is all I'll say, but I do hope to hear from the listeners. And let me just thank you for joining me. And what I tell my students all the time, that I hope even though the course ends, the relationships don't end. I say that repeatedly, partly just to make myself feel better that the course is ending and I don't have to say goodbye. But this is an example of what I mean, that just because the course ended, our conversations continue. And I hope they're going to have more and more of these conversations together.
Oh,
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And what is your email address?
Oh, so maybe we should, if I'm going to spell it, but it's going to be long. So we might also want to provide it in writing somewhere, but it's A, S as in Sam, E, D as in David, L as in Lucy, O, V as in Victor, S as in Sam, K as in Katie, AYA at HBS, which is Harvard Business School, .edu, which is education. So I warned, it was long. It was long, but I hope it doesn't deter you from reaching out.
Beautiful. And again, really so much gratitude to you. You are an incredible instructor and a beautiful human. And thank you for your time and your wisdom today.
And thank you to our listeners.
That's right.